Let's break down our must-start defenses and streams for Week 12 of the 2025 fantasy football season. These are the defenses that you guys have to start if you want to absolutely dominate your league mates here in Week 12 of the fantasy season. All right, let's start with the Seattle Seahawks on the road here facing the Tennessee Titans in Week 12. Just 3 fantasy points in Week 11. Not so great of a week against the Rams. Did have a forced fumble and a fumble recovery, but outside of that, allowed 21 total points and 249 total yards and no other turnovers. And this is a very highly rostered team, sitting at 73% rostered, one of the very best defenses overall when it comes to fantasy points scored. But I do think that there might be some managers out there who are a little bit concerned with what we saw this past week, but just don't overthink this one whatsoever. This is still the absolute must-start defense of the week. Going up against the Tennessee Titans, a team that has allowed the most fantasy points to opposing defenses throughout the course of the season. No matter what, we are trying to start whatever defense is facing Cam Ward and the Tennessee Titans. No interceptions this past week for Cam Ward in Week 11, but he still has had an interception in every game since Week 3 except for 2, and he did have a lost fumble this past week, so we're sitting at 4 lost fumbles since Week 6 of the season, and there's a lot of injuries going on at the wide receiver position for the Tennessee Titans. Ultimately, we just know that this is a good spot when we're facing Cam Ward and the Tennessee Titans. So I know a lot of you guys out there who own the Seahawks, you're not fretting, you're not worried whatsoever going into Week 12, but I'm just here to reassure you guys they are still one of the very best, if not the best defense to start here in Week 12 of the fantasy season. Next up, we have the Cleveland Browns on the road to face the Las Vegas Raiders, coming off of a 16-point fantasy performance in Week 11 at home against the Ravens. They gave up 23 total points, but they had 5 sacks, 2 interceptions, and a defensive touchdown, allowed 351 total yards against Lamar Jackson and company, but still had double digits this past week, and kind of quietly, they've had double-digit fantasy performances in 3 out of their last 4 games with a ceiling of 26 fantasy points. So that, defensive line, mainly Myles Garrett, it really just puts this Browns defense in position to create turnovers throughout the course of the game, regardless of who they are facing. Now, obviously, I'm recording this before Monday Night Football has been played, but the Raiders have been another one of these teams that throughout the course of the season, we want to start opposing defenses against. Geno Smith, not including the Monday Night Football game against the Cowboys, has had 2 interceptions in his last 2 games. He's had an interception or a fumble in each of the last 4 games. Did get a little bit banged up in Week 10, so maybe there's a possibility of re-aggravation of injury, or Geno plays poorly enough against the Cowboys that we see some Kenny Pickett, and that would be just as good of a scenario for the Browns, but I don't really want to bank on that. As a matter of fact, there's also a chance that Geno Smith has a pretty good game against the Cowboys because that defense is absolutely atrocious. But for most of you guys watching, as the week progresses, you guys will have a better kind of grasp on how the Raiders offense feels going into Week 12. Either way, this is a good spot for the Cleveland Browns. They're pretty lowly rostered, sitting at 34% roster. I think that they are a very strong start here in Week 12 of the season. Next up, let's talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars on the road to face the Arizona Cardinals here in Week 12, and they had 12 fantasy points in Week 11. Only allowed 6 total points against Justin Herbert and the Chargers, had 3 sacks, an interception, and only gave up 135 total yards. Quite the dominant performance this past week for the Jaguars, who have quietly been a pretty good defense throughout the course of the season. Now, through the month of September, they were arguably the best defense in the NFL, creating a monster amount of turnovers really through the first 5 weeks of the season. They had at least 1 interception in every game, and an interception or a forced fumble plus fumble recovery in 3 out of 5 of those games. Plus, they had 4 games with 2 or more interceptions. Then we kind of got a couple of weeks of like, oh, maybe this defense is not exactly what we expected, but quietly over the last 3 weeks, they've had an interception in every single game. Only 3 fantasy points in Week 9, but the last 2 weeks, 11 or more fantasy points. So the Jaguars, another team, pretty lowly rostered here. You guys can go to the waivers, pick them up, sitting at 26% roster. They are on the road here. All the teams we've gone over today so far on the road, which is not always my favorite, but I think for most of these circumstances, it'll be just fine. And obviously facing the Arizona Cardinals here in Week 12, Jacoby Brissett, 2 interceptions completions this past week. The previous week, 2 lost fumbles. So don't get me wrong, the Cardinals, with Jacoby Brissett at quarterback, they've had some success, and it's not usually early in the game. They're typically playing from behind, and opposing defenses do have a tendency to kind of let up on them. And at the end of the day, they still produce somewhat fantasy-wise. I mean, Jacoby Brissett just set an NFL record for 47 completions off of 57 passing attempts. He still threw for 452 passing yards, which is crazy. 2 passing touchdowns. But what we do know here is that there is at least the potential for turnover in Week 12 against Jacoby Brissett and the Arizona Cardinals. So once again, I could see a game script play out here where the Cardinals are playing from behind. They do have some success as the game goes on. But at the end of the day, I think that the Jaguars defense has a very safe floor here in Week 12 of the fantasy season. Except let's talk about the Chicago Bears at home facing the Pittsburgh Steelers here in Week 12. Just 5 fantasy points this past week. Gave up 17 total points against the Minnesota Vikings. Did have a forced fumble and 2 interceptions, allowing 265 total passing yards. Kind of quietly, this is another defense that, they're not really a good defense necessarily when it comes to real life football, and they have had their struggles. They've had a lot of injuries, but quietly they just produce a lot of turnovers. 13 interceptions on the season, 7 forced fumbles, and 7 fumble recovery. So this is a team that's very opportunistic. A lot of you guys know that as well. Like I said, they haven't been the best defense overall, but they have at least helped the offense at times by creating turnovers on a consistent basis. And now we go into this Week 12 matchup with a question mark around Aaron Rodgers at the quarterback position for the Steelers. So even if he's in the game, I mean, he did have 2 interceptions and a fumble in Week 10. And this past week, in Week 11, I wasn't able to finish the game dealing with that left wrist injury. So that's probably going to put Mason Rudolph as the starting quarterback for the Steelers here in Week 12. So anytime we're facing a backup quarterback, that is a good thing. There is potential for turnover. Mason Rudolph was okay this past week in relief of Rodgers, but it was against the Cincinnati Bengals. So I don't really want to take that too much into account here. And ultimately, I think that there's just good potential for turnover in this Week 12 matchup. So the Bears, once again, pretty lowly rostered here. I know it wasn't great this past week, but they have a nice opportunity here in Week 12 for some upside if you guys are looking for a defensive streamer. All right, last of all, let's talk about the Detroit Lions. Now, I do have to record these videos before Sunday Night Football has been played, so I don't know how they looked in Week 11. I'm not exactly expecting them to have a big performance against the Philadelphia Eagles, but we do know they've averaged 11 fantasy points per game on the season. They've given you 10 or more fantasy points in 4 games on the season with 9 forced fumbles, 4 fumble recoveries, and 8 interceptions, as well as 30 total sacks. They have been a top 10 fantasy scoring defense so far on the season, and they're going to have a nice opportunity against the New York Giants here in Week 12 of the season. Now, this is what we kind of have to consider. Is I really like this if we do get Jameis Winston at the quarterback position, as he threw an interception in Week 11 and he had a lost fumble. He did run for a touchdown, and the Giants were, I think, surprisingly good on offense this past week against a pretty good Green Bay Packers defense. But still, if we get Jameis Winston as the starting quarterback on the road against the Lions here in Week 12, I think it's a really good spot. But there is definitely the chance for Jackson Dart to return, come out of concussion protocol here in Week 12 of the season as well. But I don't know. We also got to look at it here. The Giants are on the road against the Lions this week, then on the road against another tough New England Patriots defense in Week 13 before a bye week. So there is a small chance that Jackson Dart does not return in the next week or two, but I also think there's definitely a chance that he's back out there in Week 11. Now, if it is Jackson Dart, I still think the Lions kind of have a nice floor and a good opportunity at home here against, a young offense and all of that. But ultimately, what we're looking at here is if Jameis Winston is the starting quarterback against the Lions on the road, it's a great spot for the Lions defense. Now, they are a bit higher rostered at 67% rostered, but they are going to be an absolute must-start defense if Winston is the starting quarterback here in Week 12 of the season. All right, very quickly here, let's break down the rest of the schedule in case you guys were wondering why some teams didn't make the list. Let's start with Thursday Night Football. We have the Bills on the road against the Texans. Obviously, the Texans defense has been dominant this year. I don't know that I would trust them against the Bills. Plus, I hate Thursday Night Football matchups for defensive scoring purposes. So just going to keep these two out of the mix. But the Texans at least always have a floor. I don't know if that I would start them against Josh Allen and company, though. The Colts and Chiefs, certainly interesting because the last time we saw Daniel Jones play, we did get quite a few turnovers, and obviously the Chiefs always have an opportunity for turnovers, but they just had 2 fantasy points this past week, and ultimately, I'm expecting offense in that one, so I'm staying away. The Vikings on the road against the Packers. I do think that the Packers are startable this week, but they just haven't really given us any upside. They had 10 fantasy points against the Lions of all teams in week 1, and outside of that, they've had 9 or less fantasy points in every game, but obviously a good opportunity against JJ McCarthy this week. They do sit at 84% rostered as well, so I just didn't really think that they were worth talking about. And then we did see Jordan Love a bit banged up this past week, right? He was able to return to the game. And we did see Josh Jacobs also banged up dealing with a knee issue. So maybe the Vikings could be a little bit sneaky here as well. But ultimately, I'm just staying away from this matchup. The Jets will travel to face the Ravens. And I do think that a lot of people are going to start the Ravens here in week 12 of the season, as they had 10 fantasy points this past week. But I mean, they faced a banged up Dylan Gabriel as that game progressed, and then, Shadur Sanders, and they barely got you 10 fantasy points. So they will have opportunity against Justin Fields and company, but I'm just going to kind of leave them off the list, and we'll kind of just leave it at that. Now, the Steelers, we talked about the Bears, but the Steelers are coming off of a big game this past week against Joe Flacco and the Cincinnati Bengals. They had 22 fantasy points. They've had 19 or more fantasy points in 2 out of their last 3 games. But they're on the road, and I just don't really trust the Steelers' defense quite yet. I think that they're still a decent start, don't get me wrong, but just not one that I thought should make the list. The Patriots will be on the road to face Joe Flacco and the Cincinnati Bengals, but they're 92% rostered. I originally had them on the list, but I'm like, they're like the most rostered defense right now in all of fantasy, and they've had 4 or less fantasy points in 3 straight games, so I don't really trust them at the same time. Really good real-life defense, but not necessarily a great fantasy defense. And we talked about, banged up Dylan Gabriel and Shadur Sanders, so maybe there's some potential for the Raiders defense to do something this week, but they're the defense 27 in fantasy, and they're 3% rostered, and so I guess that's good. They're only 3% rostered, sorry, but I just don't trust them. I really don't, but maybe keep them on your radar if you're absolutely desperate. Then we kind of move down here. Eagles, Cowboys, not going to start either defense in that one. Falcons, Saints. First of all, I am no longer trusting the Falcons defense. I'm at least going to give it another week or so. The Falcons have a nice opportunity here, but they were my favorite defense last week. They gave us just 4 fantasy points. I don't know what it is. When Bryce Young plays the Falcons, he balls out, and the Falcons defense just cannot keep it together. We know that this Falcons defense is not good against the run, but they just did not show up whatsoever this past week against the pass and on all cylinders. So, double digits in weeks 9 and 10. Really bad this past week. They have an opportunity on the road against a young quarterback in Tyler Shuck, but I just don't know if I trust them at the end of the day. And then the New Orleans Saints, they're coming out of their bye week. Michael Penix banged up this past week. Drake London's banged up. At the end of the day, this Saints defense, I do think is a little bit sneaky at the end of the day, like I said. But I don't know that I would really fully trust them. They did have 12 fantasy points in week 10, coincidentally against the Panthers, who we've also been talking about. But I will be talking about the Saints later this week in a defenses to stash video. So I'll go ahead and let you guys know they have the best, right now, as things stand, the best playoff schedule, getting the Panthers, the Jets, and the Titans in weeks 15, 16, and 17. And they have a pretty solid schedule the rest of the year. The Falcons, the Dolphins, the Bucks, the Panthers, Jets, Titans. So keep them on your radar. I do think that they could kind of be one of these end-of-season teams that surges. Now, the Bucks are on the road against the Rams this week. The Rams coming off of a nice game against the Seattle Seahawks, but they had 4 interceptions and just 9 fantasy points. So I think that the Rams defense is decent enough here. We know that the Bucks are going to go out there and sling it, but they do have somewhat of a tendency to have some turnovers. Baker Mayfield, a fumble that was lost this past week, and an interception. So the Rams, kind of a floor play. We'll leave it at that. Then the Panthers on the road against the San Francisco 49ers. I could see the 49ers showing up in this matchup, but right now, I don't know if I fully trust teams against Bryce Young as streaming options, and this Niners defense is banged up. So part of the problem is here, as the game goes on, they just can't really keep up, even if they're playing okay defensively. This past week, only 7 fantasy points. So I'm kind of staying away from them. But they're another team with a pretty decent strength of schedule for the fantasy playoffs and leading up to the fantasy playoffs. Panthers this week, the Browns a bye week, the Titans in week 15, the Colts in week 16, and the Bears in week 17. So even though Bears, Colts have some success offensively, of course, they also have some turnovers mixed in there as well. So keep them on your radar, but they're not going to be a start for me necessarily here in week 12. There you guys have it there, my must-start defenses and streams for week 12 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. Please let me know what you guys need. As the week progresses, I'll answer as many comments as I can throughout the week and do my best to hope you guys get a dub here in week 12. While you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor, helps out the channel tremendously when you guys subscribe and hit that like button on the way out. When the videos and playlists pop up on the screen as the week progresses, we'll have everything here on the channel you could possibly need to dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. So make sure you guys go check out all the content as the week progresses. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.